Good afternoon. Welcome to Deadly Days, Tales of Dark Fantasy. Uh, Today's episode is number 78. The story is The Vampire by Georg von der Gablentz. And this might be kind of long. I guess I'm just going to take it and start it. But I translate these stories from the German. If you're interested in reading some of these, go to my webpage, bandelbooks.com. Band like a rock and roll band, EL, bandelbooks.com. You can find links there to all of them. So anyway, the vampire. 6 o'clock struck in the church tower. The factory's steam whistle sounded. Its piercing, hideous scream reached into the farthest reaches of the vast building. New life came into the tired, stooped figures of the workers who had been busy at the creaking looms. They stood up and wiped their dusty faces. The machine slowly stopped. Their arms also rested from their restless work. Their moans and groans, the loud breathing of their lungs, ceased. The men and women now took off their aprons, put on their hats, or wrapped their colorful headscarves over their hair. Soon the long dusty halls and dirty stairs echoed with hundreds of hurrying footsteps. The factory's spacious yard filled up. The group streamed out to the iron gate that bore the owner's intricate name, and spread out into the gray, narrow streets that led to the eastern suburbs. After a few minutes, the factory's multi-windowed box stood deserted, with only light clouds of smoke still crawled lazily out of the high chimney and evaporated into the sky. A hazy atmosphere lay over the city, heavy with the coal dust that had risen from all the towering factories during the day. It began to rain in fine, barely noticeable drops, like a thick fog. But it was only a passing cloud, and it soon moved on in the yellow evening sky. Anna Witt hadn't noticed the brief rain. Her slender figure hurried along the sidewalks towards a side alley where she had found accommodation a few days ago with Mrs. Hutchke, the landlord of all the apartments. At the corner of the street, a man emerged from the darkness of a doorway. He seemed to have been waiting for her, and, after saying a loud greeting, put his arm tenderly around her waist. The girl looked up at him with love in her eyes and snuggled close to his side as she walked. The glow of a gas lantern fell dimly through the dirty, still damp windows onto the couple, and illuminating the young worker's face with a dim yellow light. His features were open, good-natured, but he looked a bit snobbish and vain with his neatly groomed mustache. But Anna Witt loved her Karl. She particularly liked his neat beard and the harmless and sincere expression of his brown eyes. Conversing quietly, they walked side by side to Anna's house. They remained standing in the doorway for a long time, in the shadow cast by the wide robes across the narrow gray steps. They talked about their upcoming wedding because Karl earned a good wage as a worker in a large bookbinding factory, from which he had already put aside many thalers. And Anna also had a savings bank account into which she deposited every spare penny. In a few months, they hoped to have enough money together that they could dare to think about starting their own small house. Then the long, frustrated wait would finally be over. For several years they had met almost every day on the same corner when Anna returned home after the factory closed. The pretty girl had been offered many marriage proposals, including by men who had a small amount of capital of their own. But she had resisted all such temptations out of love for her Karl. 8 loud bangs rang out from the tower of St. Nicholas's Church where the two finally parted with a passionate kiss. She unlocked the front door and climbed the narrow, steep stairs to her apartment, while the young man went to the tavern where he was accustomed to eat with other unmarried workers. The girl ran up the quietly creaking steps as quickly as the darkness would allow. The gas lamps on the landings of the stairs only burned up to the second floor. Poor people lived further up. Given the low rent, the owner didn't think it was necessary to provide lighting for the entrance up there. Here, everyone could see how he found his way or how he punched a hole in his head. Anna knew the worn steps exactly, so she saved herself from lighting a match and groped in the dark with her hand on the smoothly rubbed railing to the entrance to her hallway. She opened the door as quietly as possible with the handle and crept on her toes to her room so as not to be heard by the curious old woman, because she did not love the spiteful and feared woman, Mrs. Hushkey, who ran the attic, who lived in the smoke-blackened old house over the years as a widow. She earned her living by doing laundry in the neighborhood and renting out sleeping quarters to factory girls. There was something lurking and malicious in her reddened eyes. Her fingers, bent and contracted by gout, were full of hard wrinkles like the feet of a large rooster. The children in the neighborhood called her nothing other than the gray owl and ran away in fear when they saw her. She had a reputation for being stingy and greedy. If one of the poor girls couldn't pay on time, Hushkey took everything from her, even her torn dress, because she never deferred the rent for even a day. That was what she called her principle. Need had forced the girl to move in with the old woman. She reached her attic unseen. The slanted window had been open. Perhaps it had been blown open by the wind while she was away. It closed so badly because the bolt was worn out, and the landlord allowed nothing to be done up here. But the rain had gotten wet on the floor, and she had to wipe it up quickly, because when the old woman saw the stain, there would be harsh words. She quickly took a rag, knelt down, carefully folding back her dress, and began to dry the floor. Long ago, someone painted it brown, but for a while now, you can only see traces of the paint in the corners. Then Anna closed the window and attached the latch to the window cross with a piece of string. But it had gotten cold in her room, and if she wanted to work on her laundry, she had to have warm, nimble fingers. She wouldn't be able to sew with stiff joints. There were still a few coals in the coal box. She collected them and placed them carefully and quietly in the oven. If only old Hushkey didn't come in now, thought Anna. Otherwise, she'd be arguing again about this waste of heating material. She was just about to light the match when she heard the landlady's slippers slurping in the hallway. Anna quickly put the box in her pocket, jumped up, and blushing in embarrassment, went to work at the table. She positioned the small, dimly burning lamp so that the shadow of a wooden chair fell on the wet spot on the floor. Hushkey couldn't notice anything. One could hardly have found a more disgusting face than that of the old woman who now entered Anna's room without knocking. On the shapeless body with high shoulders and a short neck sat a head that was far too large and seemed to be just a face. The lower, strongly receding voice half disappeared under a dirty, large hood. Two protruding, stiff loops on this hood resembled the upright ears of a bat. In the wide mouth, between the thick lips, two large yellow teeth stood out like the tusks of a boar. You could also see them when the old woman closed her mouth. Some misfortune had once crushed the bridge of her nose. It gave her face something animalistic. Old Hushkey slowly closed the door behind her and pushed her body towards the table. "Good evening, my beautiful child." Her voice had a hypocritically friendly tone. Her eyes slid around the room, lurking and curious, as if they were looking for something. The girl offered her one of the rickety chairs with a short greeting and sat down carefully herself so that her guest couldn't see the damp spot. Then she took a canvas from the table, pulled the lamp closer to her, and grabbed after her needle and thread. "Well," the old woman began in a drawling tone, "how is the wedding going, Anna? Will you have enough money soon?" Money? Should the landlady have some of her money and want to borrow it? Anna became suspicious. "Yes, I think there will be enough in 2 to 3 months. Then we can think about it. I'll be done with my laundry soon." So, the old woman sat there in silence for a while. Her hands folded over her stomach. Her breath was very short, and every time she exhaled, it sounded like a quiet whistle coming out of her mouth. Meanwhile, the girl ran her hands over her work with busy fingers. If only it hadn't been so cold, she would have loved to heat up the stove, but she didn't dare to do it. The needle always wanted to slip from her stiff fingers, and Anna was tired and sleepy. She hoped her visitor would soon go out again. What could have caused the hideous Hushka to sit down next to her? She otherwise paid little attention to her tenants. With a deep breath, she began again. "Look, Anna, it must actually be quite stupid or boring to wait so long for the wedding. But of course, if you have to save what little you have, it will take a long time to get enough together. And getting married costs a lot of money. I know that only too well. And when I think about how easily a pretty girl can actually get money if she just wants to, I would like to know how that is supposed to work. You can do it in the simplest way in the world without any effort or work. When I think, for example, of Martha, who, God knows, has nothing special about her, since she goes with the fine gentleman, what she has for beautiful things. You wouldn't believe it. Well, you're certainly much prettier. I don't want to say anything else, but the gentleman downstairs from the second floor, if you only knew how he speaks of you. Just leave me alone or I'll tell my groom. I don't want to hear about it. You know very well that I am engaged to my Karl." The girl had answered briefly and irritably. She was annoyed by the audacity and impudence of the old woman who made such mean insults to her. She knew that the black-haired Martha next door was having an affair with someone who gave her a lot of money and had recently given her a gold bracelet and a watch. But she didn't like that kind of thing. It didn't end well. What noise and scandal there had been when Martha gave birth to her child a year ago. Of course, the poor worm died again soon after birth. Back then, old Hushke had spoken completely differently and loudly scolded the screaming and whimpering girl for her carelessness and the trouble she was causing. She didn't get involved in things like that. What would her old mother out in the country have said about it? She also loved her Karl sincerely and was faithful. When the old woman clearly noticed that her attempts had no effect, she stood up and moved with a sigh towards the door. Meanwhile, she stopped once more, her calloused hand on the doorknob. She looked around at the girl with a fake look. "Well, whatever you want, dear Anna. I only mean well with you. Just think about it. Money is money." Her slurping footsteps faded away in the dark hallway, but her eyes had taken on an ugly shine. The old woman had barely gone out when the girl stood up. breathing heavily, took the matches out of her pocket and lit the fire in the stove. The flames crackled up. She yawned, a heavy tiredness coming over her. Nevertheless, she sat down to her work again. But despite the warmth that began to flow through the lower attic, the fingers did not really want to obey her will. All sorts of thoughts ran through her head, thoughts of the groom and the wedding, but she also couldn't completely forget the landlady's ugly proposal. Money is money. The old woman's lurking and piercing glances had rested on her face and her figure. Anna stepped in front of her dresser and saw herself in the small broken mirror in the black lacquered wooden frame. Yes, she was pretty. Mrs. Hushke was right. And yet she hated this sneaky false person, despite all her flattery. She didn't mean it well. She certainly didn't. How cruel and bad it had been of her to throw the weak, consumptive sewing girl out on the street just because she couldn't pay the rent for a single month. And how many times had the poor thing starved so that she could make the rent? And only on this one occasion she hadn't been able to get it together. Coughing and crying, she had gone out into the snow and the darkness and the wet with her little bundle that contained her few belongings. Anna had given her a pair of mended woolen stockings and her old blue headscarf because she felt so sorry for her narrow, pale face, her thin shoulders and arms, and her torn shoes. She almost regretted giving this small gift, as the sick girl had been taken to a poorhouse and died there a few weeks later. The warm blue headscarf came from her own mother, who had once given it to her as a farewell. So she was attached to it, and who knew what had become of it now? Thinking like this, she continued sewing diligently. She had to finish this dress with the little lace. She wanted to wear it to her wedding. It was getting warmer and warmer in the room, and her sleepiness was increasing. She could hardly keep her eyes open. The white canvas began to flicker before her eyes. She no longer saw where her needle was sticking. She just wanted to lie down for a moment. Maybe the tiredness would go away, and then she could do some more work on her dress. However, out of thrift, she turned out the lamp and threw herself on the bed, dressed. She only opened the blouse and the waistband of the skirt so that it wouldn't be so warm, and lie down more comfortably. Then she closed her eyes and dreamed. She had never had such a vivid dream. Above her head rose the columns and vaults of a large church. Brown carved benches stood in long, long rows, one behind the other, right in front of the high altar with the shiny gold crucifix. And behind the altar were high, colorful windows through whose paintings the sun's rays shone, blue, red, green, and dead straight stripes shimmering right into the middle of the room. Countless tiny glowing dots danced like fireflies on the sun's rays and swirled around incessantly. On one of the pointed arrows of light also hit the small golden cross she had pinned on as a brooch, the last gift from her deceased grandmother. The cross seemed to grow in all the light. It shone as if it were set with precious stones, and yet it was only gilded and worn, and otherwise had such a dull glow. She herself was dressed entirely in white. She wore her dress with the lace trim, wore the myrtle wreath on her hair, and walked slowly and shyly towards the altar with her head bowed. But her Karl walked next to her, tall and slim, in a black suit with a top hat in his hand. Behind them came their old mother. She walked stooped, as she always did, and carried a hymn book. Curious people were sitting on the church pews everywhere. Martha was among them, her room neighbor, with the gold bracelet and the new watch on a shiny chain, but without her fine gentleman. The poor, consumptive girl also leaned in the corner of a bench close to the aisle and looked at her with large, restless eyes, sad and questioning, just as she had wandered through her strange life. She still had her blue scarf on her head. How the dark eyes stood out from her pale face. The big doorman from the factory also sat at the front of the church with his wife. He was wearing the green Sunday coat with the shiny buttons, and the woman was wearing the new black silk dress with red bows. Anna liked the people because they were always good and friendly to her, and sometimes exchanged a word with her as they rushed past at the end of the day. That's why she nodded to them with a smile and proudly pointed out her fine friends to Karl. From the half-dark depths of the church came the mighty roaring tones of the organ. The boys sang in the gallery. 1,000 lights shone on silver candlesticks from the altar. Anna leaned firmly on her husband's arm in such great happiness that she wanted to scream out loud in blissfulness. Now they were finally united for life, as a man and a woman. To the right and left of the altar, on wide marble steps, stood angels in long white dresses, wearing myrtle wreaths on their blonde curls and holding golden staffs in their hands. The angels arrived on the sun's rays. Anna kept looking at them, but she wasn't surprised. The girl tossed herself restlessly side to side in her sleep. In the church, it suddenly became twilight, so dark. The white figures of the angels had disappeared and the bright lights had all gone out. Where was her Karl, who had just stood at her side? Where were her relatives, her friends? They must have already left the church because she stood all alone in the middle of the large, wide room. She called out her husband's name in fear. Her voice failed. No sound came from her open mouth. Now she wanted to hurry to the exit, but an invisible force held her feet. A chain tied around her chest. She was unable to move. The high pillars of the church swayed, moved, leaned against her as if they wanted to converge and crush her under the force of their stone feet. The dark pews pressed against her, from in front, from behind, from all sides, creaking and noisy, coming in to crush her between them. The soft, running organ tones had long since faded away. Only a roaring and pounding went through the walls from the approach of the stone giants, just like in the machine room of the factory. The ground trembled beneath her. The sun no longer shone through the colorful church windows in warm colors. Its light flowed cold and pale around the columns, which relentlessly moved toward her, and around the benches that pushed together, narrower and narrower. Liberation finally came. She heard her voice. She opened her eyes with a stifled scream. The dream was gone. Still half asleep, she looked around, but gradually she came back to her senses and recognized her surroundings. There, in front of her, stood the black iron stove, with the sloping ceiling of the room weighing down above her. There was a white object on the table. What was that? That's right, the old woman had left her bonnet there. She had completely missed the fact that she had put it down. The moonlight fell just right on the white hood. Its glowing disk was just above her window, which is why it could shine in so fully and unhindered through the skylight. Otherwise, the room was dark. Only the bright moonlight lay as if one could touch its white spun threads with one's hand, glaring over the crumpled hood and on the polished floorboard. Couldn't she get up, light the lamp again, and work? But she couldn't move a limb. Her head was still so full and wild from the strange experience. Sweat beaded on her forehead and her hands trembled slightly. What oppressive desire there was in the room. Of course, she alone was to blame for her bad dream. Why had she laid down in the moonlight? If only she didn't fall asleep again straight away, then the dream might come again. She felt as if it was still standing close to her, just behind her, and had scurried into the black stove to frighten her again and whisper terrible things in her ears. If she opened the window, things would get better. Then the cool, invigorating desire of the night would come into her room. She would lose the pain that stabbed and stabbed in her forehead above her eyes. If she opened the window. With a great effort, she pushed her arm forward. She opened her half-opened eyes so wide that they emerged from their sockets with a petrified look. Her temples were pounding, her heart stopped. A completely white face looked into her room through the moonlit window. It was the hideous old husky with her red eyes. Her head was swollen and bloodless. This was exactly what the face of the drowned woman had looked like when they had once pulled her out of the muddy channel of the Spree in her presence. On her head sat the white cap that had just been lying on the table. The long loops moved, trembling up and down on her like the antennae of an enormous insect. The girl looked more closely. There was no doubt that the disfigured, ugly face with the protruding teeth belonged to her landlady. But what was she doing staring at her in the moonlight? No, it wasn't old Husky's face. It was a different face. But how did the head with its terribly staring eyes get up there at the window? Anna wanted to close her eyes so that she could no longer see the ghost and give her aching brain other thoughts. But she had barely closed her eyelids when an inner force, a paralyzing fear, forced her to look up again. The blood stopped in her veins. Her teeth chattered together as if in a fever. The head, with its trembling, groping up and down feelers, stood on her bed. Just a head, no torso, no limbs. With one leap, it jumped noiselessly from the window onto the foot of her bed. There it crouched and grew, becoming bigger and heavier. Its horns almost hit the sloping ceiling of the room. The staring eyes, big and round like dinner plates, kept looking into hers, sucking her into them, as if they wanted to pull her tired eyes, out of their sockets. The entire room was now dark. Only the moon shone full and bright on the snow-white, corpse-like, gigantic face. An unbearable burning sensation raced through Anna's head. Now she could only see blurry, more and more blurry, finally nothing at all. Terrible fear seized the girl. She wanted to scream for help, but she felt it was too late. It had already happened. She was lost, at the mercy of the ghost. When she tried to use her feet to push it away, she found it difficult to lift her knees as a sudden intense pain shot through her body. She sank, feelingless, powerless, into a deep, infinitely deep black abyss. The morning dawned. The sparrows on the roofs became lively. Workers were running towards the factories. The men, mostly shivering, had their hands in their pockets. The women and girls wrapped their headscarves tighter around their necks. The first trucks rolled sleepily over the bumpy pavement. Pale, like a rascal with a bad conscience who had spent the night outside behind the fence, the full moon moved across the sky and hid behind the nearest tall house. Mrs. Hushkey walked across the hallway of her apartment to the small kitchen to make her morning coffee. She had not yet put on her bonnet, and her sparse hair hung untidy and tangled around her ugly face. Then she stuck her nose into the air and smelled in all corners of the dark hallway. What a strange smell that was! Where could it have come from? It smelled similar to gas. Could one of the dissolute girls have done something stupid, like forgetting to turn out the lamp? She ran into all the rooms. It wasn't with Martha, and there was nothing noticeable with her neighbor either. Who else was here? What did that mean? Anna, usually the first up, was still in bed, and what a stifling vapor filled the room. She quickly opened the window. Fresh air streamed in. The rising sun sent one of its golden rays into the room, shining on the quiet temples. Her mouth opened as if to scream. Her eyes were glazed over and half closed. Horrified, they looked at the bonnet on the table. Anne's chest was bare and felt cold as wax. Her knees were drawn convulsively to her body as if she had tried to push something away at the foot of her bed and no longer had the strength to stretch her limbs out again. With a muffled scream, Mrs. Hushkey rushed out of the room and in her haste left the door open. She was afraid to be alone in her apartment and ran down the stairs. Dirty children were playing in the street. They ran away screaming. What eerily flickering eyes the gray owl had today, and how monstrous her enormous head appeared to be. The end of that story. Kind of a creepy Halloween story. Till next week. Thank you.